is the name of the game. From the claws of monsters or the heat from a ball of flame, or strength in numbers is a roll of the dice.
Well, that was a rocky start. Great games at your table. I'm Jonathan Albin, and this is Nikos RPG. And today we are talking about a lot of topics all at once, so I just want to make sure you get caught up on what we're talking about. We are going to be covering a ton of things, 5 particular topics, each one being a full deep dive in a short period of time in digest form so that we can cover a lot of information in a short period of time. First on the list, we're going to trace the evolution of combat mechanics from the game's origin, Dungeons & Dragons' origin back in 1975, all the way up to the most recent system changes in D&D, as well as the broad range of other properties that are out there. We'll talk about the way the games were initially crazy and seat of the pants and narratively driven, and how they've become compartmentalized and how they are more confining. Next, we're going to tackle the concept of dice protocols. The idea that there is an etiquette to utilizing dice in a game that needs to be established early in your sessions so that your players feel comfortable and are aware of how that will make the games run more smoothly. Next, we're going to add a new section that I'm going to be starting that I will tentatively be able to use for, I have an X account, and I'll be utilizing that in the future for what I'm calling Monsters in a Minute. And so that is literally a fast creation process that I devised in particular for Nikos RPG, but could be suitable for any other role-playing mechanism as well. Then we're going to talk about the really effective use of productive retcons. Now, I know that's, in some people's terminology, that's a bad word, but we're going to be talking about how it can be really useful and effective in keeping everybody on track. And then finally, ironically, perhaps, we're going to talk about consistency in role play. When your sessions go on over weeks and weeks and months, it gets easier. But when you're initially starting, especially if you've come from a one-shot environment where the particulars of your persona, your character, aren't as stipulated, developing a consistency in your role play. Oh, it's hard to say twice. And in doing so, you'll make your games more enjoyable, and they will feel more like part of a larger story. So buckle up, sharpen your pencils, get your character sheets and your notepads ready, because we're going to journey through this in a relatively short period of time. Let's see. So here we go. All right, so when we're talking about the evolution of combat, let's go back to the 1970s. The offset that launched role-playing games, as we know it, the initiation of Dungeons and Dragons, had come from a war games background. So the concept of making combat a simple process was sort of foreign. The idea was instead you wanted to capture the realism, the dynamics that occurred in combat in a way that would feel like a story, so that it would be able to be more easily stated as the role-play portion of it. In other words, the die rolls were up to the game master fundamentally to interpret, and he would resolve the narrative of how conflicts occurred. And that was well and good for a short period of time, but as the players began to actually get a hold of the role-playing materials, the player's handbook and the other guides, suddenly they had more of an understanding, and therefore there was an increasing pressure to provide some form of agency to the players. And this was done in the earliest form by creating the idea of skills and proficiencies and really translated to a numerics condition. So in other words, if your warrior advanced his skill with his weapon, then he would get a modifier on his die roll. And that modification was okay. It gave an edge, if you will, to a more veteran player, a character with more time under his belt. But as game mastery adjusted and changed, so did the player base. And so the rules were made more accommodating to the player's decisions late in the story of Advanced Dungeons and Dragons, before they stopped using that terminology. The release of the various guides for the classes came out, and those books really expanded the there was a reduction in the requirement of the player to actually think about his character's existence, what that persona was, and how they came to be as they were. And instead, it opened up a considerable amount of imitation. In other words, the players could now play the characters as they saw them in a television program or whatever, and as they played that new dynamic, even though it was a change in the mechanics of the combat that allowed for that, this idea of building a character towards or conforming with a story type or an elemental type, a fundamental mechanism, it changed the dynamic. This was further exacerbated when they started adding in the skills, and then beyond the skills, well, the skills. There was always a problem with the skills mechanism, and we'll talk about that in a later episode altogether. But the concept of having particular feats that could be chosen at whim at every point of advancement, that became, because of the fact that those feats were now being defined not by the game master but by the rules of the game, it changed the dynamic away from the power of the player being amplified and the power of the storyteller or game master being reduced. And that change also meant a change fundamentally in the rules. It had been so that the game master had been responsible for the majority of the narrative interpretation of the die rolls, but as the character's knowledge base increased and the amount of information that the players brought to the table that was outside of the purview or control of the game master, then allowed the players to have more agency. Now, see, there's a good thing about that. The liberty and freedom that allowed to the player was often at the expense of the storyteller or game master, because now the cultures and the ambiance of the world no longer mattered, because the players could go pick out a skill from a list of a book that they saw once, and then that modified their play mechanism. It felt more like agency, but it was actually more pigeonholed, because now you were scrambling to look through the books for what would give you those modifying values, and it moved the game more away from being a narrative storytelling experience to a fundamentally akin to a video game element, where you were using formulas and punching in numbers and changing the dynamics. The earlier process using the 2-hit armor class 0 default and then deriving the numbers on the fly went away, and the players simply would have on their character sheet what their total mods would be on any given die roll, so they would just cross-reference. So it made for a microcosmically faster decision, and yet it led to catastrophically long conflicts and combats, because the hit point pool was beginning to be problematic. When it was originally designed, a conceptual character with 2 or 3 or even 4 dice was a manageable number, because there were monsters that could do enough and damage, if you will, to counterbalance that. But as the years went by and the amount of skills increased and the characters' levels got into the 10, 11, 12, suddenly the hit point pool that defined them was no longer tenable for the game master to put any kind of real threat upon the player within the mechanism unless he added additional contrivances. So ultimately we get to the point where the character build is being run through on dozens and dozens of websites telling you how to optimize your character, how to build it to reach a certain number of objectives within the character building mechanism, and therefore you have now taken the imaginative side of the game and replaced it with an imitative where you're simply looking for your optimal options and builds and making the play mechanism therefore less story based and more games based. And to some people, maybe you're one of them, perhaps the idea of playing a role play game as a game that happens to have some role play elements is a far cry from the original concept of playing a role playing game that happens to have some dice in it. And speaking of dice, okay, so now we're going to talk about dice protocols. I remember the first time I saw a player launch a dice clear across the table. You know, shake, 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 roll, the dice go flying and bouncing, and it tumbled under the DM's chair, it went up against the far wall, and the players at the table were all paused to wait to see whether the dice roll would stand as it was, whether they would have to re-roll it, whether they'd have to completely re-roll the set. The tiny moment crystallized into the importance of having some sort of shared etiquette, some sort of protocol for what dice mechanisms and what dice processes we're going to use. At many tables, any die that jumps off the table or even rolls out of its rolling space is an automatic re-roll. In the case of percentage dice, some people argue if one of the dice went into the tray and the other one didn't, you just simply re-rolled the one that fell out. Others say, no, you have to re-roll the entire roll. Some groups use trays and determine their dice zones very particularly, and others you can roll it on the book or whatever. And don't forget that there are people who really hold to the idea that one set of dice is lucky and another set of dice are unlucky. These are the cursed ones. Those are the ones that get us the best numbers. The dice become an extension of the player. Most players treat their set of dice with some form of attachment. Again, maybe even, I've got a friend of mine who actually names his dice, not only by their color, but their quirks. So he's got his Lucy Twosies that roll, according to him, roll better on getting low numbers. And then he's got his Mighty Nines, which, of course, there's no 9 on a 6-sided dice, but he still considers them to be powerful because they are numerically, the 6 is, well, I go into that later. But anyway, you can actually offend people, certain people, if you reach across the table and they even touch, let alone roll, their beloved dice. So you have to take care of that. Now, all of this is well and good, but the reason for dice rolling is to create a random number generator for the result to be derived from that number. And there are times when those dice rolls need to be transparent and everybody has to be aware of what they are. And other times the die rolls can be, private, so to speak. So, for example, when a roll happens for the whole table, or when the dice roll will affect the entire table, trust can erode if the game master rolls them behind the screen. So if the DM needs to conceal rolls for other narrative reasons, that's one thing, but that's not what we're talking about here. We're talking about the very concept of the rules that you set forth on how to use dice. And again, I'm referring to them as protocols, more like guidelines, so that a player, if they've got particular peccadillos about their dice and they don't want certain things to happen, they don't have to. But open rolling is by far one of the most common protocols. Roll the dice where people can see them and leave them on the table long enough for them to be read. Since every result tentatively is a shared moment, a shared experience, the actual results of the die roll are not as important as the openness of it. I've said this before. One of my great players, and yes, I'm talking about you, Victor, has a T-shirt that he wears often to the game set that says, "Bad rolls make good role play." So if you roll poorly and the numbers come out with negative or low value, unacceptable values, all it does is makes the story more dynamic because the game master has to work around that. Now, although it sounds mundane, the idea of dice etiquette does also preserve the flow of the game. So, in other words, instead of having to have somebody every round look for which dice they're going to need, you can have a firm baseline on how the dice rolls are handled. If it's a bunch of dice, have enough room for them to roll, for example. If you are talking about rolling with advantage, do you allow them to roll both dice at the same time, or do you actually have them roll one and then the other sequentially, as the rules state? But I've seen players and games at tables that did it differently. So their whole point is that the dice etiquette will keep the focus on the drama of the story and the need to focus on the actual die roll at a minimum. Okay, so this is the new Monster in a Minute, and I want to set this up by saying that I don't have my timer on it. I'm going to look at my clock, and we are going to attempt to do this in 1 minute. The idea was to do it so that it can be a video short. So here we go. Today's Monster in a Minute is called the Twilight Scarab. The Twilight Scarab is a large beetle, roughly the size of a small wolf. So that's not a large beetle. That's a giant beetle. But it's relatively small for giant beetles as far as that's concerned. But it's got basically three marks. And I use the word marks in particular that stems from the Nikos RPG. It's how you define your monsters and creatures at any rate. So the first thing is the Twilight Scarab is fundamentally a plain brownish bug, if you will, during the daytimes. But as the light starts to fall off in the evening, it's the runes. There are actually markings on the side of the animal which are said to have been placed there by their creators, but the emblems, the marks on its wings, start to cast a muted, otherworldly light. Not too far different from the very idea of lightning bugs, but on a much larger scale. It seems that they use these symbols or whatever to frighten their opponents, and because of the fact that they are hunted for their use in magical effects, you can see why they'd be rather defensive about it. The second mark of the Twilight Beetle is it has the capacity or propensity for magical energy drain. If it gets near a magical resource, it will start to gather that for itself, and the coloration and the lighting of the beetle becomes more enhanced, more brilliant, and more scintillating. Now, once it's latched onto a physical source, such as a piece of magical stone, maybe a player's magical item, that energy transfer ramps into high speed, and the weapon, the item, whatever it is, happens to become very difficult to hold on to because of the physical heat that it gives off in this magical transfer. The more they absorb, the brighter they glow, and there's a rumor that when they get to a certain brilliance level, the beetle actually explodes, expending that magical energy in a spherical area around it. Third thing about them, the third mark of the Twilight Scarab is that it doesn't travel in solo. As a matter of fact, once it finds a source for magical energy that it can feast upon, it actually shudders its wings, creating a humming sound. And between the humming sound and the brilliant light they are expending, they tend to draw more of the twilight scarabs to the area, causing them to be able to therefore fight with, unfortunately, the cunning of a pack. And so therefore they are provided fundamentally a coordinated pack ability, and therefore they now work as a group. So you're not dealing with just one of these beetles attacking your magical source, but it's a group. And so the monster in a minute is out. I'm way over. I've got to trim these down. I may have to create a better way of doing the narrative. But the concept here is the Twilight Scarab's a great low to moderate level beastie for your personas to engage with, your player characters to engage with. And the concept of them is that they are found in any climate and prefer areas where there is moisture because of the inherent magics that are generally found around running and flowing water. All right. All right, so this next section is on productive retcon. The idea of a need to be retroactive and looking at something after the fact and changing it are considered in many cases to be story breaking. They tend to backtrack, and in certain occasions, game masters have done the unconscionable and have used retcon to undermine player decisions. But sometimes, even in a campaign that is open sandbox, there are times when something in the campaign demands a change, demands an alteration. Imagine realizing, for example, that a plot point deals with earlier information, but that information wasn't provided, or discovers an important event that may have been misunderstood, or players are acting upon it based on incorrect information. Rather than muddling up the narrative and having to recreate extensive portions of the campaign, a productive retcon can realign the plot, fix all those small glitches, and maintain the group's trust in the game's internal logic, so long as it's done with some basic steps in place. The first trick is transparency. If you're going to make a change like this, Game Master needs to announce that there's a problem, describe particularly what the problem is, perhaps not necessarily pointing fingers and blaming, but simply saying that the problem with it is going to cause greater problems down the road, and therefore can call for a quick retcon of that situation. So if something went awry in the combat scene in the last week's episode, at the beginning of this week's episode, it's best to call it out and clarify what needs to be changed and get an idea of consensus from your players. And maybe even if they've got ideas that are more salient or cleaner, utilize those. The idea is to create a mechanism that is comfortable for the players, but it also allows the game master to make those adaptations. Now, players do have to be a part of the conversation. If there's going to be a change and things are going to move numbers around, then suddenly the retcon by itself is problematic and will cause the players to feel that the choices they're making in game are being perceived as meaningless, and so that needs to be cut off immediately. By talking it through like this, you reaffirm for everyone their collective enjoyment is actually the top priority, and that the mechanism can be adapted or adjusted by the players in that moment as well. So that way the story can move on with a renewed clarity rather than trying to unravel the work of previous weeks or previous times. Some people feel that consistency is drudgery and it takes away from the creativity of the scenes. But the consistency here, of which I'm speaking, is the players and their decision making. If they've, for example, chosen that they are going to be horse riders, then in 2 weeks you don't want have to deal with them saying that they're riding on in a chariot instead. The idea is that you want consistency within your gameplay. It's actually the motor that holds most games groups together, especially over the long haul. Whether you meet once a week, once a month, or just whenever you get together, it's crucial to remember, for example, the recurring NPCs' names, keeping track of how many arrows that are left in your quiver and these kind of things, and also maintaining a track on what home rules are currently being used on a week-over-week basis, so that the players don't feel confused and the game master is not himself undermining his own work by being inconsistent. So this consistency, however, doesn't mean rigidity. The things that happen in the game can change the story, over the longer term, and the idea of having a creative new perspective can always be brought to the fore if that's what the players agree to. You don't want to make these changes in an arbitrary fashion, especially if they're going to impact one, two, or more of the players in the group. Some of the most examples of consistency is simply writing down tiny notes so you remember the name of the guy that you talked to in the bar 2 days ago. The idea is that if there are going to be any retcons that come up, that everyone needs an opportunity to change their notes on the situation and revise that as well. The idea here is that if a character's favorite pub relocates from one town to the next town, maybe there was a reason. There was perhaps a proprietor that needed to move to another location. But you want to hold to consistency, and this in particular applies to rules consistency. So as things happen in the game the following week, if someone else tries the same event, same action, it will have the same effect. The biggest payoff from any of these consistency issues is trust. When your players can actually put their feet down in your world and step off in any direction, they need to know that they're actually on solid ground, because that way their lives, their characters become part of your story until it becomes a tapestry of storytelling that is basically assisted or resolved by everyone. Okay, so we've been all over the board. We've been talking about combat in the early days compared to the later days. We've talked a little bit about dice etiquette. We've introduced the Twilight Scarab as a new monster and described how the monster in a minute will work. And obviously it was over time, so we have to go faster next time. And we've also discussed how retcons are important if they are profitable and productive, and ultimately that those can be reduced overall by increasing the unassuming power of consistency and making sure your games are the same week over week over week. Remember that one of my biggest statements is that we want to make your story make sense. So take these into account and do what you can, if you will, to improve your games. And of course, in the comments, leave me any discussion on how you can see things that I've said might be better interpreted, or if there's additional information that has happened in your game. Like, for example, what are your particular dice etiquette rules? Some of those might be interesting to the rest of us, and I'd love to have a great conversation about that. Now, before we leave, make sure you go down below and hit all the buttons so that the algorithm knows that you're part of our audience. I want to thank you for being here, and we will see you tomorrow. This is Jonathan Alvin.